Hey everyone, welcome back to Canada, the Illusion of Freedom and System of Control. Today we're going to do an overview of the Public Health Act for the province of Alberta. Some of you may have heard of what's going on with new legislation in all the provinces and federally over this COVID stuff. Some of the Public Health Act is not new, but it was recently revised with new COVID provisions. That being said, let's jump right in and have a look at what it says. We always look for the enacting clause. Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, enacts as follows. As always, we want to look at the definitions and interpretation sections of any act, statutes, regulations, or codes, because it's very important we understand the legal meaning of the word that they're using in the act, statute, regulation, or code. And if a specific word isn't mentioned in the act, statute, or regulation or code, the highest legal definition in Canada comes from the Interpretation Act. So that being said, it's very, very important that we understand the definitions that are used when we're trying to read and interpret statute law. So, first of all, carrier means a person who, without apparent symptoms of a communicable disease, harbors and may disseminate an infectious agent. So without any apparent symptoms of a communicable disease, holds and may spread an infectious agent. Certificate means a compulsory examination and treatment certificate. Compulsory. That seems nefarious, doesn't it? Communicable disease means an illness in humans that is caused by an organism or microorganism or its toxic products and is transmitted directly or indirectly from an infected person or animal or the environment. Contact means any person or animal suspected to have been in association with an infected person or animal or a contaminated environment to a sufficient degree to have had the opportunity to become infected. To have had the opportunity to become infected. All right. Epidemic means the occurrence in a community of persons of a number of cases of a communicable disease in excess of normal expectations. That seems rather broad, doesn't it? A number of cases in excess of normal expectations. Immunization means the administration of a biological agent to a person to increase that person's resistance to the effect of an infectious agent or its toxic products. Infection means the entry and multiplication of an infectious agent in the body of a person or animal. Institution means a correctional institution as defined in the Corrections Act, a facility as defined in the Mental Health Act, a nursing home within the meaning of the Nursing Homes Act, and the premise where a child care program that is licensed under the Child Care Licensing Act. I won't bore you with the rest. Isolation means the separation of a person or animal infected with a communicable disease from other persons or animals in a place and under conditions that will prevent the direct or indirect conveyance of the infectious agent from the infected person or animal to a susceptible person or animal. There we go. This one is interesting. Public health emergency means the occurrence or threat of an illness, a health condition, an epidemic or pandemic disease, a novel or highly infectious agent or biological toxin, or the presence of a chemical agent or radioactive material that poses a significant risk to public health. Means the occurrence or threat of an illness. Does that mean every flu season from now on? That constitutes a public health emergency under this definition? The occurrence or threat of an illness, a health condition. Once again, these are pretty broad definitions, giving a wide level of interpretation and scope. Quarantine means, in respect of persons or animals, the limitation of freedom of movement and contact with other persons or animals, and, in respect of premises, the prohibition against or the limitation on entering or leaving the premises. During the incubation period of the communicable disease in respect of which the quarantine is imposed. That's some broad definitions, and once again that leaves a lot of interpretation on the powers. This one is rather interesting. Isolation and quarantine. A medical officer of health who knows or has reason to suspect the existence of a communicable disease or public health emergency within the boundaries of the health region in which the medical officer or health has jurisdiction may initiate an investigation to determine whether any action is necessary to protect the public health. Whether the officer knows or has reason to suspect the existence of a communicable disease. And we've learned through the definitions what a wide definition these things have. Where the investigation confirms the presence of a communicable disease, the medical officer of health shall carry out the measures that the medical officer of health is required by this act and regulations to carry out, and may do any or all of the following. Take whatever steps the medical officer of health considers necessary. Whatever steps to suppress the disease in those who may already have been infected with it, to protect those who have not already been exposed to the disease, to break the chain of transmission, and prevent spread of the disease, and to remove the source of infection. Take whatever steps the medical officer of health considers necessary. Again, that is a whole lot of power for a person to have. Remove the source of infection by order. Prohibit a person from attending school. Prohibit a person from engaging in the person's occupation, or prohibit a person from having contact with other persons or any class of persons. Interesting, they use the term "or any class of persons." If you've watched any of my other videos, as I've just explained, the highest legal definition of a word comes from the Interpretation Act. And in that Interpretation Act, as I have shown you in previous videos, the word person is a corporation, not a man or woman. So it's interesting they say any class of persons. For any period and subject to any conditions that the medical officer of health considers appropriate. Wow. Where the medical officer of health determines that the persons engaging in that activity could transmit an infectious agent. Prohibit a person from having contact with other persons. Prohibit them from working or attending school. Where the investigation confirms the existence of a public health emergency, which in the definitions, once again, we learned how broad the definition of public health emergency is. So it wouldn't be hard for an investigation to confirm, yep, it's flu season, public health emergency again. Has all the same powers and duties in respect of the public health emergency as he or she has under subsection 2 in the case of a communicable disease, and may take whatever other steps are in the medical officer of health's opinion necessary in order to lessen the impact of the public health emergency. So the public health officer may take whatever other steps in that person's opinion necessary to lessen the impact. And the public health emergency, we learned what a broad definition that is. The jurisdiction of a medical officer of health extends to any person who is known or suspected to be infected with a communicable disease, illness or health condition. Illness or health condition? Wow, that's a pretty broad scope. A carrier, a contact. Well, we learned what the definition of contact was in the definitions. So the jurisdiction of the medical officer of health extends to any person who is known or suspected to be. So, wow. If the medical health officer sees you with a runny nose, they may suspect you to be infected with a communicable disease, illness or health condition, be a carrier, or have had contact. Susceptible to risk of contact with a communicable disease, illness or health condition, or exposed to a chemical agent or radioactive material, whether or not that person resides within the boundaries of the health region. So, that's interesting, isn't it? So if you're an American and you're bopping through Alberta maybe on your way up to Alaska, the jurisdiction of a medical officer of health extends to any person who is known or suspected to be infected with a communicable disease, an illness, or health condition. That's a pretty broad jurisdiction to have. Entry for examination, where a medical officer of health knows or has reason to believe a person suffering from a communicable disease referred to in section 20 may be found in any place, or that any place may be contaminated with such a communicable disease. The medical officer of health may enter that place without a warrant for the purpose of conducting an examination to determine the existence of the communicable disease. So if the medical officer of health suspects, well, it's influenza season again, ladies and gentlemen. I suspect that place there's influenza. They can walk in without a warrant and conduct an examination. Where a medical officer of health is conducting an examination pursuant to subsection 1, the medical officer of health may order the detention of any person, order the closure of the place, including any business that is carried on in it, until the medical officer of health has completed the investigation, but not for a period of more than 24 hours. So they can order the detention of any person for 24 hours. Not only that, when the medical officer of health is not able to complete the investigation within 24 hours, the medical officer of health may make an application to a judge of the provincial court for an order to extend the period of detention or closure under subsection 2 for an additional period not more than 7 days. And the judge may make the order accordingly. So they can grab any person, have them detained for 24 hours. If they're not finished their investigation, they can go to a judge and extend that detention another 7 days. Wow. Examination. Where a medical officer of health knows or has reason to believe that a person may be infected with a communicable disease referred to in section 20, that person shall, at the request of the medical officer of health, submit to an examination necessary to determine whether that person is infected with the disease. Where that medical officer knows or has reason to believe, you look like you have influenza, you must come in for an examination. In conducting an examination pursuant to subsection 1, to determine the existence of a communicable disease, the medical officer of health may require from any person who has knowledge of it the production of any information concerning the disease, including the sources or suspected sources of the disease and the names and addresses of any persons who may have been exposed or to become infected with the disease. Effect of isolation or quarantine. Where a person infected with a communicable disease requires isolation or quarantine as prescribed in the regulations, the person shall be isolated or quarantined in a hospital or other place approved for the purpose by the medical officer of health. Excuse me. No person who is suffering from a communicable disease for which isolation or quarantine is required under the regulations shall remain or be permitted to remain in any public place other than a hospital or other place approved under subsection 1 unless a medical officer of health is satisfied the presence of the person in the public place would involve no risk to public health. Wow. For the purpose of this section, person infected with a communicable disease, referred to in subsection 1, and a person who is suffering from a communicable disease, referred to in subsection 2, include the following persons. A person entering Alberta and having traveled internationally, a close contact of a person who is confirmed as having COVID-19, a person exhibiting any of the following symptoms that are not related to the person's pre-existing illness or health. Let me say that again. A person exhibiting any of the following symptoms that are not related to the person's pre-existing illness or health condition. Cough, fever, shortness of breath, runny nose, sore throat, any of those. Unbelievable. Order of Lieutenant Governor and Council. Where the Lieutenant Governor and Council is satisfied that a communicable disease referred to in section 20.1 has become or may become epidemic, or that a public health emergency exists, the Lieutenant Governor in Council may do any of the following. So once again, we know the definition of a public health emergency is absolutely broad and ridiculous. So the Lieutenant Governor can order the closure of any place. In the case of a communicable disease, order the immunization or re-immunization of persons who are not then immunized against the disease or who do not have sufficient other evidence of immunity to the disease. Let me say that again. In the case of a communicable disease, order the immunization or re-immunization of persons who are not then immunized against the disease or who do not have sufficient evidence of immunity to the disease. So there you go. All of you people out there that are saying forced vaccinations are a conspiracy theory, there you have it, right in the Public Health Act. And I might add, this is not a new revision. This has been in the Public Health Act for quite some time. Where a person refuses to be immunized, pursuant to an order of the Lieutenant Governor and Council, the person shall be subject to this part with respect to the disease concerned as if the person were proven to be infected. So if you refuse to be immunized, you're going to be treated as you are infected. And we've seen they can come in your house without a warrant, they can lock you up, they can talk to the judge and say this person won't get their vaccination, so can we keep them in here for another 7 days? I'm not finished investigating yet, and the judge can lock you up and so on and so forth. Again, a lot of people have said that vaccination cards and things like that, that's conspiracy theory. Well, here we have the Public Health Act of Alberta that says issue of certificate. Where a physician, community health nurse, midwife, or nurse practitioner knows or has reason to believe that a person is infected with a disease prescribed in the regulations for the purpose of this section and refuses or neglects to submit to a medical examination for the purpose of asserting whether the person is infected with that disease, to medical, surgical, or other remedial treatment that has been prescribed by a physician and that is necessary to render the person non-infectious, or to comply with any other conditions that may have been prescribed by a physician as being necessary to mitigate the disease or limit its spread to others. So they will issue you a certificate saying you've been very naughty. Where the medical officer of health is satisfied as to the sufficiency of the evidence that a person may be infected, the medical officer of health shall issue a certificate in the prescribed form. Where the physician referred to in subsection 1 is a medical officer of health in the health region in which the alleged infected person is located, the physician may issue the certificate referred to in subsection 2. A person in respect of whom a certificate is issued may apply to a judge of the Court of Queen's Bench at any time for cancellation of the certificate. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. If you refuse the vaccination, you are treated as though you are, in fact, infected. And if you refuse or neglect to submit to an examination, to any treatments, to comply with any conditions, you get a certificate. And that certificate stays with you until you are deemed non-infectious or no longer a danger to the public, or if granted by a judge. Pretty nice, hey? Here we go, continuing on. Authority of certificate. A certificate is authority for any peace officer to apprehend the person named in it and convey the person to any facility specified by the medical officer of health who issued the certificate within 7 days from the date the certificate is issued. So a peace officer can just come and apprehend you. For a physician to perform any test or physical examination required to determine if that person has a communicable disease, and to detain that person at the facility for the period required to obtain the result of the examination. Gee, that could be a long time. For any physician to treat or prescribe treatment for that person in order to render that person non-infectious with or without the consent of the person, and detain the person for that purpose. Let me say that again. For any physician to treat or prescribe treatment for that person in order to render that person non-infectious with or without the consent of the person, and to detain that person for that purpose, and for the physician to prescribe any other conditions necessary to mitigate the disease or limit its spread to others. Where a person is detained pursuant to a certificate, the medical director of the facility in which the person is detained shall forthwith inform the person or the person's guardian, if any, of the reason for the issuance of the certificate, advise the person or the person's guardian, if any, that the person has the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay. Release. Subject to Section 2, a person who is detained in a facility pursuant to a certificate shall be released not later than 7 days after the date the person is admitted to the facility pursuant to the certificate, unless an isolation order is issued under Section 44. A person who is detained in a facility pursuant to a certificate shall be released forthwith if the physician who examines the person certifies that there is no evidence of active disease, or that although there is evidence of active disease, the physician is satisfied that the person will comply with the treatment and any other conditions ordered by the physician in a manner that will ensure protection of the public health. Where a person is released pursuant to Section 41(2)(b), the person shall comply with the treatment and any other conditions that are prescribed by the physician assigned by the medical director at the facility. Where a person who has been required to submit to treatment, or comply with the conditions following the person's release, fails to undergo treatment or comply with the conditions, a medical officer of health may issue an order in the prescribed form to a peace officer or other person to apprehend that person and return that person to the facility. So if you get a certificate and you're locked up in a facility and the doctor says, okay, Pete will let you go if you follow these conditions, and you break one of the conditions, they can send a peace officer to apprehend and return you to the facility. Unbelievable. On receipt of an order under subsection 2, a peace officer or other person is empowered to arrest without warrant the person named in it and return that person to the facility. So once you get a card, they can pretty much just come and get you without a warrant and return you back to the facility. Here's another good one. Isolation order. Where one physician, supported by a laboratory report demonstrating evidence of an infectious agent, certifies, or two physicians certify that a person is infected with an organism that produces a disease prescribed in the regulations for the purpose of this section, and that the person refuses or neglects to submit to medical, surgical, or other remedial treatment, or to comply with any conditions that have been prescribed by a physician as being necessary to mitigate the disease or to limit the spread to others, the physician or physicians shall issue an isolation order as prescribed or in the prescribed form. Subsection 1 applies whether or not there is a certificate in existence in respect to the person who is the subject of the isolation order or orders. So you don't have to have a certificate. They can still order isolation for you. An isolation order under Section 44 is authority for a health practitioner to observe, examine, care for, treat, obtain biological specimens from, control, and detain in a facility the person named in it with or without that person's consent until the order is canceled under Section 46. There you go again. With or without your consent, just throw you in isolation until the order is canceled under Section 46. A person in respect of whom isolation is ordered under Section 44 shall be re-examined by a physician at least once every 7 days to ascertain whether the person may be released under Section 46. So they throw you in isolation for 7 days. They re-examine you with or without your consent. They isolate you. Then, with or without your consent, they examine you every 7 days in order to be deemed able to be released under Section 46. Section 46, where after separate examinations by each of them, two physicians are of the opinion that a person in respect to whom isolation has been ordered under Section 44 is not infectious or will comply with the condition of the person's discharge, the two physicians shall order in the prescribed form canceling of the isolation order. Wow. Warrant for examination. Any person who has reasonable and probable grounds to believe that a person is infected with a disease prescribed in the regulations for the purpose of this section and refuses or neglects to submit to a medical examination, to medical, surgical, or remedial treatment that has been prescribed and that is necessary to render you non-infectious, or to comply with any other conditions that have been prescribed by a physician. Where an information is brought before a judge of the provincial court under subsection 1, and the judge is satisfied that the person with respect to whom the information is brought should be examined in the interest of the person's own health or by the health of others, and that the examination cannot reasonably be arranged in any other way, the judge may issue a warrant in the prescribed form to apprehend that person for the purpose of examination. The warrant under this section may be directed to any peace officer and shall name or otherwise describe the person with respect to whom the warrant is issued. Where a peace officer apprehends a person pursuant to a warrant under this section, the person is deemed to be a person in respect of whom a certificate has been issued under Section 39. So you've been deemed a very, very naughty man or woman. Duty on issue of isolation order. Where a person is detained pursuant to an isolation order or orders, the medical director of the facility in which the person is detained shall forthwith inform the person or person's guardian, advise the person or person's guardian, if any, that the person has the right to retain a lawyer, give the person or the person's guardian, if any, a copy of Section 49. Section 49 is how you appeal to the court to have your certificate or isolation order canceled by a judge. They can transfer you to another facility, and we saw the facilities they named. One of them is a detention facility. This one I didn't highlight, but it's very important as well. State of public health emergency, where on the advice of the chief medical officer, the lieutenant governor and council is satisfied that a public health emergency exists or may exist, prompt coordination of action or special regulation of persons or property is required in order to protect the public health. The lieutenant governor and council may make an order declaring a state of public health emergency relating to all or any part of Alberta. On the making of an order under subsection 1, and for up to 60 days following the lapsing of that order, a person referred to in subsection 3 may order, without consultation, suspend or modify the application or operation of all or part of an enactment subject to the terms and condition that the person may prescribe. Specify or set out provisions that apply in addition to or instead of any provision of any enactment, if the person is satisfied that doing so is in the public interest. So they can suspend or modify any enactment and specify or set out new provisions that apply in addition or instead of provisions of any act or statute. If they're satisfied that doing so, well, that's in the public interest. That's a lot of power for one person to have, especially a person who's not accountable to anyone. If that person decides the lieutenant governor and council, with the advice of the chief medical officer, can pretty much do what they want. An order made under subsection 2 may be made retroactive to a date not earlier than the date on which a state of public health emergency was declared. So if they declared a public health emergency in June, then retroactively any order they make goes back to June. Well, this is reassuring. An order made under subsection 2 may not impose or increase any tax or impost, appropriate any part of the public revenue or any tax or impost, or create a new offense with retroactive effect. I'm not going to go through the rest of this document, but 5221 is pretty unbelievable. Where on the advice of the chief medical officer, the lieutenant governor and council is satisfied there is a significant likelihood of a pandemic influenza, and prompt a coordination of action is required in order to avert or minimize the pandemic. The lieutenant governor and council may make an order authorizing a minister to make orders under subsection 2. On making of an order under subsection 1 and continuing until the lapsing of that order, a minister authorized under subsection 1 may by order without consultation suspend or modify the application or operation of all or part of an enactment, specify or set out provisions in addition to enactments, if the person is satisfied that failing to do so may directly or indirectly reasonably hinder or delay action required in order to protect the public health. It's pretty broad powers. They're giving one unaccountable person to suspend laws, to change laws, to enact new laws 60 days after the public health order is up. And remember, any of these symptoms can get you as being suspect as infected. And once again, we don't see the word person in this document in the interpretation or definitions. So therefore, we would have to fall back on the Interpretation Act of person, definition of a person, which we know is a corporation. But they're, of course, like all of their other acts and statutes, they're going to try and enforce this on us. But you can see that the Public Health Act is pretty scary. In Alberta, forced vaccinations, I showed you right in their own words, this is not me saying it, this is their own words right out of the Public Health Act, that yep, you can be forced to be immunized. If you don't, you're treated as though you're infected, whether you're not, it doesn't matter. And then a certificate is issued and you're on the naughty list. And then we see what can happen when a certificate or an isolation order is issued. Basically, they can just come and snatch you up and pretty much lock you up for 7 days at a time, until they determine that you're not infected anymore. So that's pretty scary. Every person in Alberta and every person in Canada should look at their own version of the Public Health Act and read it. And make sure you read the definitions and the interpretation parts of those acts as well. Because they are on the guise of COVID, they're adding a whole lot of powers to themselves and taking a whole lot of freedom from us on suspected outbreaks and well, you saw the definitions for yourself. So in the interest of public safety, they have a whole lot of powers, and some of them are very, very recent, of course, because of COVID-19. That being said, stay tuned to the channel. If you like the content, please like and subscribe. See you guys soon.